was a scene lifted from a suburban dream. A tidy, two-story home nestled in the quiet town of Frederick, Colorado. Manicured lawns, rows of houses where neighbors smiled, waved, and trusted each other. And inside one of those homes lived the Watts family, Chris, Shanann, and their two daughters, Bella, 4, and Celeste, 3. To anyone looking in from the outside, they were picture perfect. A handsome husband, a loving wife, 2 beautiful girls, and a baby boy on the way. If you believe a single voice can shake the silence of the world, subscribe now. If you don't, explain in the comments why you've chosen the comfort of silence over the weight of truth. But pictures can lie. And in this story, the mask of perfection would be torn away, revealing something so dark, so unthinkable, it would horrify the nation. A Facebook family. Shanann Watts loved to share her life online. Her Facebook page was a living photo album of love and motherhood. She posted daily videos of the girls singing, birthday celebrations, romantic tributes to Chris. Every photo was polished, every post upbeat. Shanann seemed to radiate positivity, even when things weren't going well, because in her world, appearances mattered. She was also a hardworking woman. Despite struggling with lupus and other health conditions, she was fiercely driven. She worked as a promoter for a health supplement brand called Thrive, a multi-level marketing company that pushed weight loss patches and vitamin capsules. Her job required her to be visible, active, and always on. And she did it all raising 2 toddlers while pregnant with her third, running a household, and managing a growing online brand. Chris, on the other hand, was the quiet type. He worked as an operator for Anadarko Petroleum, a job that kept him out of the spotlight. On social media, Shanann praised him constantly. She called him my rock, the best dad, and my best friend. But those who were close noticed something else. Chris had begun to pull away. Beneath the surface, behind the smiling selfies and vacation videos, financial stress loomed. The Watts had filed for bankruptcy in 2015. Their mortgage payments were mounting, medical bills added to the burden. But Shanann kept pushing, kept posting, clinging to the image of success. In early 2018, she learned she was pregnant again. She surprised Chris with a video, wearing a shirt that read, "Oops, we did it again," while holding a positive pregnancy test. On camera, Chris smiled, gave a small laugh, but his reaction wasn't as joyful as her previous videos. Subtle but noticeable. Something had changed. And by the summer of 2018, that change had grown into something else entirely. Chris had started an affair. Her name was Nicole Kessinger, a coworker from Anadarko. They met in the office. She was single. He told her he was separated. And as the relationship intensified, Chris became emotionally detached from his family. Shanann noticed. She told friends Chris was acting distant, cold, distracted, and no longer interested in intimacy. Their conversations turned tense. Their texts became clipped. During a 6-week trip Shanann took to North Carolina with the girls, she sent emotional messages to Chris, begging him to show affection, to tell her he loved her. But his replies were empty, mechanical. Shanann was terrified she was losing him. What she didn't know was that he was already gone. August 13th, 2018. The morning began with silence. No texts, no calls, just a growing sense of unease. Shanann had returned home around 2 a.m. that Monday morning after a business trip in Arizona. Her friend Nicole Atkinson had dropped her off and expected to hear from her later that day. But Shanann missed a doctor's appointment. She wasn't answering her phone, and when Nicole checked her location, it still showed her at home. Something felt wrong. Around noon, Nicole drove to the Watts residence. The front door was locked. Shanann's car still in the garage, her purse inside, her phone and medication untouched. But there was no sign of her or the girls. She called the police. Body cam footage from the responding officer would later show a calm but oddly expressionless Chris Watts answering the door. He allowed the officer inside, showed him the house, pointed out the missing items. His tone was detached, robotic. His answers too neat, too rehearsed. Nicole, visibly distressed, pleaded with the officer to look deeper. She would never leave without her girls. She would never leave her car. Her purse is here. This doesn't make sense. And she was right. It didn't. If you're out there, that evening, local news cameras arrived. Chris stood on the porch, arms crossed, swaying gently as he spoke. "If you're out there," he said to the camera, "just come back. If somebody has her, bring her back. I need to see everybody again. This house is not complete without anybody here." But the public wasn't buying it. There was no emotion in his voice, no urgency, no desperation, just a strange, almost rehearsed calmness. People watching the footage felt it. Something was deeply off. The mask slips. Police began working quickly. Surveillance footage from a neighbor's camera showed Chris backing his truck into the driveway early that morning, something he rarely did. Investigators noted his strange behavior during questioning. His neighbor off camera would later whisper to police, "He's not acting right. He's usually quiet. Something's up." At home, Chris began deleting messages from his phone. He tried to cover his tracks with Nicole Kessinger, but the walls were closing in. The search for Shanann and the girls exploded across media. Vigils were held, flyers posted, and still Chris maintained his innocence. But those who knew Shanann refused to believe she'd vanish willingly, especially not pregnant, especially not with 2 toddlers. The end of the illusion. In just 48 hours, the public's perception shifted. Chris was no longer the grieving husband. He was the only suspect. On August 15th, he failed a polygraph test. Shortly after, he confessed. First, a lie he claimed Shanann had killed the children, and he, in a rage, killed her. But the truth was far worse, and it would come out soon. The illusion of the perfect family had shattered. What the world would come to learn was not just the story of a murder, but a betrayal so brutal, so complete, that it would leave an indelible scar on the public conscience. This was no crime of passion. This was methodical, cold, calculated, and the worst was yet to come. The news spread fast. A pregnant woman and her 2 little girls had vanished without a trace. By August 14th, 2018, less than 48 hours since Shanann Watts had returned home from her business trip, the media had picked up the story. Local networks ran headlines: "Pregnant Frederick woman missing with 2 daughters." In the calm suburb of Frederick, Colorado, where the loudest noise on most days came from sprinklers and passing school buses, the disappearance shook the community. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no screams, no sounds in the night. But Shanann was gone, Bella was gone, Celeste was gone, and Chris Watts, the husband, the father, the man who claimed to love them, stood in the middle of it all. Panic and questions. From the moment Shanann's friend Nicole Atkinson called the police on August 13th, something had felt wrong. Nicole was the last person to see Shanann alive, having dropped her off just before 2 a.m. after their Thrive business trip in Arizona. When she couldn't reach her friend the next day, her instincts kicked in. She knew Shanann. This wasn't like her. She wouldn't miss a prenatal appointment. She wouldn't leave without her girls. She certainly wouldn't leave her phone, purse, medication, and car all behind. It wasn't just suspicious, it was terrifying. So Nicole drove to Shanann's home, knocked on the door, and called the police when there was no answer. The strange behavior of Chris Watts. When the officer arrived, Chris was already home. He greeted them shirtless and appeared calm, too calm. Police body cam footage captured his demeanor. Robotic, distant, oddly composed. He unlocked the house and invited the officer in, pointing out where things were. Shanann's car? Still in the garage. Her phone? On the couch. Her purse? On the kitchen counter. The girls' favorite blankets? Missing. At one point, he picked up Shanann's phone, swiped it open, and paused. A message appeared on the screen. He froze. Quickly, he tried to dismiss it, but the officer caught it. Later, that message would be tied to his mistress, Nicole Kessinger. Still, Chris stuck to his story. He said he'd last seen Shanann early that morning when she came home. They had a quiet conversation. She was going to take the girls to a friend's house for a playdate, he said. But he didn't know where she went after that. It didn't add up. This house is not complete without them. Later that day, Chris made an emotional appeal on local news. Wearing a gray t-shirt, standing on his front porch, he looked directly into the camera. "If you're out there, just come back," he said. If somebody has her, please bring her back. I need to see everybody again. This house is not complete without anybody here." The performance fell flat. Instead of evoking sympathy, Chris's appeal raised red flags. His tone lacked urgency. He didn't stumble over his words, didn't show real distress. His arms were crossed. He swayed back and forth like he was waiting for a bus. Public reaction was swift. Social media lit up with suspicion. "This guy is lying. His eyes look dead. Why isn't he crying?" One comment read simply, "He knows exactly where they are." The search intensifies. Meanwhile, the search for Shanann and her daughters escalated. Police began interviewing friends, neighbors, co-workers. They gathered surveillance footage from nearby houses. Cadaver dogs were brought in. Search crews combed through fields in nearby areas. The small town of Frederick, suddenly overwhelmed with news trucks and cameras, tried to process what was happening. This was the kind of story people saw on TV, not in their own backyard. Neighbors organized prayer vigils, purple ribbons. Shanann's favorite color were tied around trees and lampposts. Volunteers passed out flyers. But as the hours passed with no trace of Shanann, Bella, or Celeste, hope began to fade. The neighbor's camera. Then came the break. Whoa, a neighbor named Nate Trinastich had a security camera installed on his house. It faced the street and captured a portion of the Watts driveway. On the morning of August 13th, it showed Chris backing his truck into the garage at around 5:27 a.m. The timing was suspicious. Chris rarely backed in his truck. His job didn't require heavy loading or tools that early. Even more troubling, the camera didn't show Shanann or the girls leaving the house. What was Chris doing at that hour? When detectives viewed the footage at the neighbor's house, Chris stood beside them. He watched nervously, arms folded. He barely spoke. After they finished, he quickly left. Once Chris was gone, Nate turned to the officer and whispered something chilling. "He's not acting right. I've never seen him like this. He's usually quiet, but now, something's off." Leads begin to unravel. Over the next 24 hours, Chris began to crumble. Detectives noticed he was evasive. He deflected questions. He changed his story subtly with each interview. His phone records showed deleted texts and suspicious gaps in communication. He refused to take a polygraph. When police pushed, he agreed and failed. The polygraph administrator didn't hold back. "Chris, this is not going to look good. You did not pass the test. There's no way to sugarcoat it." With nowhere left to run, Chris asked to speak with his father. The partial confession. In the interview room, Chris sat across from his dad, Ronnie Watts. What happened next was caught on camera and stunned everyone who watched it. "I cheated on her, Dad," he began, breaking down. He claimed Shanann had killed the girls in a rage after learning about the affair and that he had killed her in response. It was a feeble attempt to minimize blame. A desperate lie from a man who could feel the walls closing in. Investigators knew better. The evidence told a different story. The GPS in his work truck, the missing blankets, the cell phone data, the neighbor's camera, the failed polygraph. All signs pointed to one thing. Chris Watts had murdered his wife and children and dumped their bodies. But they needed more. A shocking discovery. Chris finally told them where to look. He led investigators to an oil work site owned by Anadarko Petroleum, about 45 minutes from the Watts home. It was remote, desolate, surrounded by oil tanks and barren fields. That's where they found them. Shanann's body was buried in a shallow grave beneath the dirt. Nearby, 2 oil tanks stood tall and silent. Inside them, Bella and Celeste, dumped like waste, each child placed in a separate tank through an 8-inch opening. It was unthinkable. Investigators wept. Seasoned officers left the scene in tears. No one could comprehend how a father, their protector, could do this. Chris Watts had not just killed his family. He had erased them, discarded them, hidden them. The nation reacts. As the news broke, public fury exploded. Monster! Sociopath! How could anyone do this? Shanann's friends and family were devastated. Her mother broke down during interviews, describing Shanann as a light in the darkness. The girls, Bella, who loved to sing and Celeste, nicknamed Cece, full of fire and energy, were mourned by millions. And Nicole Kessinger, the mistress, found herself at the center of the storm. She cooperated with police and said she had no idea Chris was still married. But questions lingered. Did she suspect something? Did she know more? Public interest only grew. True crime forums dissected every detail. Documentaries were announced, and the story was far from over, because the true extent of Chris's coldness had yet to be revealed. By the third day of the investigation, the narrative Chris Watts had clung to was crumbling fast. The father who once stood on his porch pleading for the return of his family was now the center of a homicide investigation. His body language, his shifting statements, and his lack of genuine grief had sent a clear signal to law enforcement. Something was very, very wrong. But no one outside that police station knew just how deep the rot went. Polygraph pressure. On August 15, 2018, just 2 days after Shanann, Bella, and Celeste were reported missing, Chris Watts agreed to take a polygraph test. Investigators hoped the lie detector would be the final crack needed to break through his wall of silence. The test was administered by Tammy Lee, a skilled interrogator with a calm but piercing approach. Before it began, she looked Chris in the eyes and told him plainly, "You're not going to pass this polygraph." Chris smiled weakly. "I'm not hiding anything." But he was, and the machine knew it. The questions were simple. Do you know where your family is? Did you cause Shanann's disappearance? Are you being completely honest? Every response was a lie, and every lie showed up. After the test, Tammy didn't sugarcoat the results. "It's clear," she said. "You were deceptive on every single question." Chris leaned back in his chair, silent. He was cornered, but he wasn't ready to give up control, not yet. A father's presence. The investigators changed their approach. They allowed Chris to speak with his father, Ronnie Watts, in private, hoping the presence of someone he trusted might push him to confess. In the small interrogation room, the cameras kept rolling. Chris hunched over the table, face in his hands. Ronnie leaned forward, voice trembling. "What happened, son?" There was a long pause. Then Chris looked up and spoke. "Shanann, she hurt the girls." It was a calculated lie, one final attempt to twist the truth. Chris claimed that after he confessed to Shanann about the affair and wanting a separation, she flew into a rage and smothered the girls. In his words, he lost it and killed her in retaliation. Ronnie sat in stunned silence. His son had just confessed to murder, but was also pinning the children's deaths on the woman he had killed. It was sickening, and investigators didn't believe a word of it. The truth cannot be buried. Chris was arrested that day. By August 16th, the charges began to stack. 3 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of murder of a child under 12 by a person in a position of trust, 1 count of unlawful termination of a pregnancy, 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. Still, Chris hadn't revealed the full truth, but evidence was mounting fast. Phone records placed him at the oil site where the bodies were found. Surveillance footage showed no one else entering or leaving the home. GPS data from his work truck confirmed his movements that morning. And perhaps most damning, Chris had tried to delete texts from his mistress, Nicole Kessinger. The mistress speaks. Nicole Kessinger quickly became a lightning rod in the public eye. She was 30, intelligent, and independent, a geologist at Anadarko Petroleum, where she met Chris Watts in early 2018. At first, she said he told her he was in the final stages of a divorce. He was charming, attentive, and seemed like a good man trying to escape a broken marriage. But something felt off. As the media frenzy exploded, Nicole came forward. In her interviews with police, she described growing suspicions during their relationship, how Chris seemed evasive about his home life, how he told her he didn't want any more children, how he once told her his wife took the kids to a playdate and hadn't come back. When Shanann's disappearance made headlines, Nicole said she panicked. She searched for Shanann online. She realized the woman Chris said he was divorcing was pregnant, very much still his wife. And then she called the police. Nicole cooperated fully. She gave them access to her phone, her messages, her search history. She admitted to Googling phrases like, "Can cops trace text messages?" And how long do phone companies keep records? Searches that painted her as nervous, maybe even complicit. But investigators found no proof she knew about the murders beforehand. Her voice during those interviews was haunted. If I had any idea, I would have never been with him. Why haven't you subscribed yet? Drop a comment below and let us know what's holding you back. We'd love to hear your thoughts. The disturbing timeline. With forensic evidence, phone data, and interviews, investigators began to reconstruct the timeline of the murders. Early morning, August 13, 2018. Around 4 a.m., Chris wakes up before Shanann. According to his final confession, they argued. He told her he wanted to separate. In a rage, he strangled Shanann in their bed with their daughters nearby. Then, with his wife's body wrapped in a sheet, he loaded it into his truck. Bella and Celeste, still alive and frightened, were also placed in the vehicle. He drove them, his wife's corpse and 2 living children, to the oil field where he worked. There, in a desolate location surrounded by oil tanks, he killed his daughters. First Celeste, then Bella. Bella's final moments would haunt even the most hardened detectives. She fought back. She pleaded, "Daddy, no!" Then silence. Chris stuffed their small bodies into the narrow openings of 2 separate oil tanks. He buried Shanann in a shallow grave nearby. The sheer coldness, the methodical approach, the emotional detachment stunned everyone. This wasn't just a crime of passion. It was calculated, planned, executed, facing the consequences. As the case unfolded, public anger intensified. Millions followed the story online. Documentaries began production. News stations ran constant coverage. Shanann's family was shattered. Her parents, Frank and Sandy Rzucek, wept openly during interviews. Her brother spoke of a sister who never gave up on love, a daughter who was too good for this world. They demanded justice. Not just for Shanann, but for Bella, Celeste, and baby Nico. At Chris's arraignment, he stood silent in an orange jumpsuit, his head bowed. Gone was the husband from the porch, the man begging for a safe return. In his place stood a shell, a killer, a man exposed. He faced the possibility of the death penalty. But Shanann's family, in a surprising act of mercy, requested that it be taken off the table to avoid prolonged court trauma. A family betrayed. The Watts murders struck a nerve because they shattered a comforting illusion. That home is safe, that family protects, that a father could never turn on his children. But Chris Watts did. The mask he wore of a calm, supportive father had fooled everyone, neighbors, friends, even Shanann. And when that mask slipped, the face underneath was terrifying. The cracks that began with lies and cheating ended in suffocation and death. The betrayal wasn't just murder. It was the ultimate violation of trust, a destruction of innocence. And as the legal process moved forward, one question lingered in everyone's mind. Why? Why would a man with a beautiful family, a new baby on the way, in a seemingly stable life throw it all away? By the time Chris Watts stood in front of a judge in late August 2018, the entire world already knew he was guilty. But what the world didn't yet know, what had not yet been made public, were the details. The nightmarish truth of what actually happened inside that home in Frederick, Colorado. The order, the method, the sheer calculation behind the murders. Chris had confessed, yes, but his first confession was a lie. He said Shanann had killed the children, and he killed her in a rage. A story designed to minimize his guilt, to keep some sliver of control. But the evidence didn't support it, neither did his demeanor. So investigators pressed further, and what finally emerged was a confession so horrific, so cold, that even seasoned FBI agents reportedly cried while hearing it. The final confession. In February 2019, 5 months after his sentencing, Chris agreed to speak with agents from the FBI and Colorado Bureau of Investigation. He was already behind bars, serving multiple life sentences. There was no legal reason to talk. But something made him open up. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe boredom. Maybe he simply wanted to be in control of the narrative one more time. Sitting in a small room at a Wisconsin prison, Chris Watts described the murders in chilling detail. August 13th, 2018, 4 a.m. It began with a whisper, not a scream, not a violent outburst. Just a quiet conversation between Chris and his pregnant wife, Shanann. She had just returned from a business trip hours earlier. Their marriage was already on the brink. Shanann had sensed the growing distance, the late-night texting, the loss of affection. But that morning as she lay in bed, Chris told her the truth. He didn't love her anymore. He didn't want the baby. He wanted to leave. Shanann was stunned. They argued. She accused him of cheating. He admitted it. Emotions flared. But then, without any real buildup, Chris climbed on top of her and began to strangle her. She didn't fight back, he said. She cried. And her final words, according to him, were, "You're never going to see the kids again." Then silence. The girls were awake. After killing Shanann, Chris wrapped her body in a sheet. He dragged it down the stairs. And that's when Bella, 4 years old, walked into the room. Her eyes were wide, confused. She had heard something. She asked, "What's wrong with Mommy?" Chris lied. He told her Mommy wasn't feeling well. Then he loaded Shanann's body into the back seat of his truck. Bella and Celeste followed, still in their pajamas, and climbed into the back seat, sitting beside the corpse of their mother, their heads just feet away from her wrapped body. Chris drove 45 minutes to the oil site with his 2 daughters alive and their dead mother beside them. At the oil site, it was still early morning. The sun hadn't fully risen. The oil field was quiet, remote, the perfect place to hide something. Or someone. Chris pulled in and parked the truck. He claimed he wasn't sure what he would do at that point, that he thought about just running, but instead he did something far worse. He pulled Cece out of the truck first, and on a blanket near the oil tanks, he smothered her with his bare hands. She didn't scream. She was too small, too trusting, too unaware of what was about to happen. Bella sat in the truck, watching, waiting. When Chris returned, she looked at him and asked, "Is the same thing gonna happen to me as Cece?" She knew. She knew what her father had done, and still she didn't run. Chris then smothered Bella. She fought back. She bit her tongue. She scratched his arms. Her autopsy would later confirm defensive wound signs that she had struggled, that she had begged for her life. And then, she was gone. Disposal. Chris moved quickly, methodically. He took Celeste's small body and opened one of the 2 oil tanks. The opening was only 8 inches wide, barely enough for a grown man's head. Still, he forced her in head first. Then he did the same with Bella. Finally, he walked over to a shallow trench nearby and dug a grave. He placed Shanann's body in it, and as if trying to erase the evidence of the pregnancy, buried her with the fetus still inside. Then he left. He returned home and pretended as if nothing had happened. The psychology of a killer. Chris Watts didn't snap. He wasn't a man pushed past his limits by stress or mental illness. What made this case so terrifying was exactly the opposite. Chris had been planning it. Phone records showed he researched travel destinations with his mistress, Googled the costs of starting a new life. He had stopped being intimate with Shanann, stopped engaging with his daughters. He had already emotionally disconnected. To him, they weren't obstacles to love. They were obstacles to freedom. He later admitted, "I didn't want to be married anymore. I didn't want to be a dad anymore. I just wanted it all gone." But instead of divorce, he chose murder. Autopsy revelations. When the autopsy results were released, they confirmed what the confession had already made clear. Shanann had been strangled. Her blood vessels had ruptured. She had fought with all the strength of a woman 15 weeks pregnant to live. Celeste and Bella died from smothering. But Bella had bruises, scratches. She knew. She resisted. The most heartbreaking detail of all? When Bella's body was recovered, her mouth was covered in crude oil. Her lungs were filled with it. She had been alive even if just for a moment when her body was pushed into the tank. That fact haunted the forensic team for months. It is Chris behind bars. After receiving 5 life sentences, Chris was transferred from Colorado to a maximum security prison in Wisconsin for his own protection. Inmates had threatened to kill him. One even tried to attack him while he was being moved. He now spends 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. No TV, no physical contact. He receives letters, some of them disturbingly, from women offering him support or love. But mostly, he is alone. In later interviews, Chris expressed regret. He said he dreams of his daughters, that he sees Bella's face every night before he sleeps, that he feels evil. But his monotone voice, his lack of emotion, says otherwise. He killed not in rage, but in cold blood. And that, to many, is what makes Chris Watts one of the most disturbing family murderers in American history. A community in mourning. Back in Frederick, the town still reels from what happened. Shanann's family built a memorial near the oil site, a place of peace, flowers, teddy bears, ribbons. Her father wept at the sight, saying, "My daughter didn't deserve this, and neither did Bella, or Celeste, or baby Nico." Their story has become one of the most talked about true crime cases in modern memory, not because of how complicated it was, but because of how ordinary it appeared before the tragedy. Chris Watts was not a stranger in the night. He wasn't a career criminal. He was a father, and that's what made it so chilling. When the dust finally settled, when the bodies had been recovered, and the full horror confessed, the world was left staring at a single, chilling question. Why? Why would a man like Chris Watts, who appeared to be a devoted husband and father, destroy his entire family in a calculated act of annihilation? And perhaps more unsettling, how many more walk among us, hiding behind smiles, selfies, and status updates? The courtroom silence. On November 6, 2018, Chris Watts entered a Colorado courtroom and did what no one fully expected. He pleaded guilty to all 9 charges against him. There was no trial, no cross-examination, no need for Shanann's family to relive the gruesome details in public. In return for sparing him the death penalty, the prosecutors had agreed not to seek capital punishment. But it wasn't out of mercy for Chris. It was to protect the Rzucek family from the trauma of years of appeals, of media coverage, and of having to face their daughter's killer over and over again. During sentencing on November 19th, the courtroom fell heavy with silence. Frank Rzucek, Shanann's father, stood at the podium, tears streaking down his face. His voice cracked as he said, "I trusted you to take care of them, not kill them. They also trusted you. You disgust me." Sandy Rzucek, Shanann's mother, spoke with grace and devastation. "I am broken. I will never be the same. I just want to know why." Chris sat in a jail uniform, eyes down, expressionless. When the judge handed down the sentence, 5 life terms plus 84 years, he remarked, "This is the most inhumane and vicious crime that I've handled out of the thousands of cases that I've seen." Chris Watts would never walk free again. The world reacts. News of the sentencing spread like wildfire, but the end of the trial didn't mean the end of public interest. If anything, the fascination with the Watts family murders only deepened. Documentaries were announced almost immediately. In 2020, Netflix released American Murder: The Family Next Door, a harrowing documentary told almost entirely through real footage. Home videos, text messages, police body cam footage, and interrogation tapes. It stunned viewers by showing not a dramatized version of the crime, but the real-time unraveling of a family. People saw the smiling videos of Bella and Celeste. They read Shanann's hopeful messages. They watched Chris lie to police while his daughter's voices still echoed in their ears. It was personal. It was haunting. And it was real. The role of social media. In many ways, the Watts case was the first true crime story of the social media age. Shanann's Facebook was a digital diary of her life. Every birthday, every trip, every hug from Chris or the girls was preserved in photos and videos. At first, these clips added to the sense of tragedy, but later they would become something more. Evidence. Her videos showed a family dynamic prosecutors would later use to debunk Chris's initial claims about Shanann being aggressive or abusive. Her messages to friends painted a clear timeline of stress, distance, and fear in the final weeks before the murders. And Chris, he had his own digital trail. Text to Nicole Kessinger, deleted searches, GPS pings from his phone and work truck. Even his search history betrayed him. Social media, once a place where Shanann had shared her dreams, had become the record of her death, the mistress in the shadows. Nicole Kessinger disappeared from public view shortly after the arrest. While investigators never charged her with anything, and she cooperated fully, the court of public opinion had already weighed in. Conspiracy theories swirled. Some claimed she had known more. Others accused her of manipulating Chris. But the truth, according to investigators, was that she had been lied to as well. In her final interviews, Nicole described feeling betrayed, horrified, and terrified of what the world now saw in her. She changed her name. She vanished from the internet. And to this day, her whereabouts remain unknown. A family rebuilding. For the Rzukeks, the wounds remain raw. They've dedicated themselves to keeping Shanann's legacy alive. Her name and the names of Bella, Celeste, and Nico have been engraved into benches, playgrounds, and memorial gardens across the country. In interviews, Shanann's parents have spoken out about the dangers of domestic abuse that hides behind charm, how sometimes the threat isn't in a raised fist, but in a quiet, calculated lie. They also endured years of online harassment. Conspiracy theorists accuse them of fabricating the story, of being involved, of staging the tragedy. Ugly claims that led them to file lawsuits against YouTubers and bloggers. They didn't just lose a daughter. They've had to defend her memory from strangers with cameras and agendas, behind bars. Chris Watts now resides at Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin, in a maximum security facility known for housing violent offenders. He's in protective custody, kept separate from the general prison population due to threats against his life. Other inmates, even in a world filled with criminals, view him with contempt. Prison sources say he spends 23 hours a day alone in his cell. He reads the Bible, writes letters to pen pals, occasionally gives interviews to journalists looking to understand his mindset. But nothing he's ever said has justified what he did. In 2022, he reportedly told a pen pal he had found God, that he now prays for forgiveness, that he's haunted by dreams of Bella and Celeste. But for most people, his words ring hollow. You can't pray away a triple murder. You can't erase the sound of a child whispering, "Daddy, no," lessons that haunt. So what are we left with? The Watts family murders didn't just devastate a family. They shattered our collective sense of safety. They showed that monsters don't always wear masks. Sometimes they wear wedding rings. Sometimes they stand beside you in family photos. Sometimes they rock their children to sleep at night and bury them the next morning. And perhaps the scariest lesson of all, there were no warnings strong enough to stop it. No signs that the average person would have recognized as life-threatening. Chris Watts wasn't a madman. He wasn't possessed. He was ordinary. And that's why his story will haunt us for decades to come. A final note. In the aftermath, Shanann's family asked for one thing. Remember the victims. Remember Shanann, an ambitious, loving mother who never stopped trying to hold her family together. Remember Bella, bright-eyed, strong, and intuitive beyond her years. Remember Celeste, playful, fearless, and full of life. Remember Nico, never given the chance to breathe, cry, or dream. And remember that behind every smiling photo, every polished online life, there may be someone silently suffering. There may be a danger no one sees. And in that darkness, let there always be light.